My foreman, Colton Jones, fired me during a terrifying earthquake aftershock, claiming my expert warnings were just female panic. As the only certified structural assessor on site, I watched in horror as his arrogance led to a catastrophic building collapse on city inspectors. Now, I'm using every legal and financial resource I've built to ensure his greedy empire crumbles into the very dust he created. The morning air in the city was thick with the usual smell of diesel and damp concrete. I stood on the 12th floor of the Sterling Heights project, my boots clicking against the raw slab as I checked the tension on the reinforcing cables. At 45, I had spent half my life on sites like this, and I knew the language of steel and stone better than I knew my own handwriting. My name is Sarah Williams, and I was the lead structural engineer for this 40-story glass and steel monster. It was my job to make sure it stood for 100 years. Colton Jones, the site foreman, was 20 feet away, barking orders at a crew of laborers. He was a man who wore his power like a cheap cologne, overpowering and unpleasant. He'd been trying to squeeze the timeline for weeks, cutting corners on the curring times for the support pillars. Every time I flagged it, he'd roll his eyes or make some comment about how I was too academic for the real world. Then, it happened. A low rumble, like a freight train passing through the basement. The slab beneath my feet didn't just vibrate, it bucked. I grabbed a temporary guardrail, my heart hammering against my ribs. It lasted maybe 10 seconds, a magnitude 5.4 that rattled the skyscrapers of the financial district. Everyone off the slabs, down the stairs now. I screamed, my voice cutting through the sudden silence of the stalled machinery. Colton didn't move. He stood there, hands on his hips, looking around with a smirk. "Relax, Williams. It's just a little morning wake-up call. We've got a schedule to keep." "Colton, that was significant," I said, walking toward him, my tablet already pulling up the real-time sensor data from the core. "We need to check the weld points on the 4th floor mezzanine. The resonance was all wrong." "The resonance?" he mocked, mimicking a high-pitched voice. "Go have a coffee, Sarah. Let the men finish the pour. We're already 3 days behind because of your assessments." I ignored the jab. I was the only person on this site certified for post-seismic structural integrity. Without my sign-off, this building was a legal liability. I began my walk around, feeling the structure. There was a groan in the steel that hadn't been there 10 minutes ago, a deep, metallic moan that told me the building was stressed. "I'm calling a site-wide halt," I told him, my voice steady despite the adrenaline. "The inspectors are on their way for the routine check anyway. They won't set foot in here until I verify the load-bearing joints." Colton stepped into my personal space, his face turning a mottled red. "You aren't calling anything. I'm the boss of this site. You're a consultant." A glorified calculator in a hard hat. "I am the safety officer, Colton. If I say it's unsafe, work stops." "You're just jumpy," he spat. "Go home and rest your nerves. We'll talk when you're less emotional." I looked him dead in the eye. "It's not emotion, Colton, it's physics, and physics doesn't care about your schedule." I walked away to start my detailed inspection, knowing the aftershocks were coming. In this part of the country, the first quake was never the only one. The earth was settling, and my building, my beautiful, flawed building, was caught in the middle. 30 minutes later, the air felt electric. The crew was back at work, Colton having bullied them back into position despite my protests. I was in the sub-basement, examining a hairline fracture in a primary column that shouldn't have been there. It was fresh, the concrete dust still white and powdery. That's when the ground shifted again. This wasn't a rumble, it was a violent, upward jolt. The aftershock hit with a fury that felt personal. Above me, I heard the scream of twisting metal and the terrifying sound of shattering glass. I scrambled up the service ladder to the staging area. "Evacuate! Get out now." I yelled at the top of my lungs. Men were dropping tools, scrambling for the exits. But then I saw Colton near the main hoist. He was shouting at a group of city inspectors who had just arrived, including Julian Reed, a kid I'd mentored since he was an intern. They were standing right under the mezzanine I'd flagged. "It's fine," Colton was yelling over the din of the sirens. "Don't listen to her, she's having a meltdown." I ran toward them, waving my arms. "Julian, get out of there. The mezzanine joints are failing." Colton stepped in my path, his hand coming up to block me. He looked manic, his ego finally overriding his last shred of common sense. "That's enough, Sarah. You've been hysterical since the first shake. I'm not letting you scare off the inspectors and cost me another week." "Colton, look at the sensors." I shoved my tablet toward him. The red lines were spiking, indicating a total structural failure in the making. He grabbed the tablet and threw it against a concrete pillar. It shattered into 1,000 pieces. "You're fired," he roared, loud enough for everyone to hear. I'm sick of this female engineer panic every time a truck drives by. Get your gear and get off my site. You're done. "You can't fire me for reporting a safety hazard," I gasped, stunned. "I just did. Security." He signaled to 2 guards who looked as terrified as I was. "Escort Ms. Williams to the gate. She's trespassing." "Colton, if those inspectors go inside, they're dead men walking." I screamed as the guards took my arms. They weren't being rough, they were just following orders, their eyes darting to the ceiling that was visibly vibrating. "They're professionals, Sarah, not like you," Colton sneered. He turned back to Julian and the senior inspector. "Sorry about that, fellas. She's been under a lot of stress. Come on, let me show you the reinforcement on the 5th floor." "It's solid as a rock." Julian looked at me, his face pale. He knew I didn't cry wolf. He hesitated, looking at the door to the inner core. "Julian, don't," I pleaded, but Colton put an arm around the young man's shoulder, guiding him toward the darkness of the building. "Don't worry about her, kid. She's just a girl who's scared of a little dirt." The guards pushed me through the turnstile and shut the heavy iron gate. I stood on the sidewalk, my heart breaking, watching the man who had mentored Julian lead him into a tomb. I didn't leave. I couldn't. I stood by my car, clutching my keys so hard they bit into my palm. I pulled out my phone and started recording, narrating exactly what Colton had just done. I needed a record of the firing, the sexism, and the blatant disregard for the sensor data. The silence that followed the aftershock was the most terrifying thing I'd ever heard. It lasted for maybe 60 seconds. Then, the sound started. It began as a series of sharp, rhythmic pops, like giant firecrackers going off deep inside the building. I knew what it was. The bolts on the mezzanine were shearing off, one by one. "Get out." I screamed at the gate, though there was no one left to hear me but the guards who were now running away from the perimeter. Then came the roar. It sounded like the world was tearing in half. From my vantage point, I saw the 4th floor buckle. The entire mezzanine level, thousands of tons of steel and fresh concrete, detached from the core. It pancaked downward, slamming into the 3rd floor, which then collapsed onto the 2nd. A massive cloud of gray dust billowed out of the open structure, obscuring everything. The sound was deafening, a tectonic grinding of stone on stone. I saw the lights inside the core flicker and die. "Julian!" I shrieked, running toward the fence. The dust began to settle, revealing a jagged hole where the main inspection area had been. The first 4 floors of the north wing were a pile of twisted rebar and broken slabs. The inspectors, Colton, and several laborers were in there. Sirens began to wail in the distance, the sound of the city reacting to the collapse. I stood there, paralyzed by the horror of it. I had spent months trying to protect this project, and in 10 seconds, Colton's arrogance had turned it into a graveyard. My phone rang. It was my sister, Bella. "Sarah, are you okay?" I felt the second quake all the way in the suburbs. "It fell, Bella," I whispered, my voice cracking. "The building collapsed. Colton fired me and then led them right into the collapse zone." "Oh my God, are you safe?" "I'm outside the fence," I said, watching as the first fire truck skidded to a halt at the gate. "But Julian is in there. And Colton, Bella, he called it female panic. He fired me because I told him it was falling." "Sarah, listen to me," Bella's voice turned sharp, protective. "You have the certifications, you have the logs. He didn't just fire you, he committed a crime. You need to call Arthur Mercer right now." "I have to help," I said, seeing the rescue workers starting to deploy their gear. "You can't dig them out, Sarah. You're an engineer, not a first responder. You help by making sure Colton never builds so much as a birdhouse again. Call the lawyer. I looked at the wreckage. I could see the flashing lights of the emergency crews reflected in the dust. My mentor's voice echoed in my head, build a foundation that can't be shaken. Colton thought he had destroyed my career. He had no idea that I was about to destroy his life. At 10:14 a.m., the world became a chaotic blur of flashing red and blue lights. The air tasted like chalk and pulverized concrete. The once majestic Sterling Heights construction site was now a jagged, smoking crater of twisted rebar and shattered stone. I stood by the command tent the fire department had hastily erected just outside the main gates. My hands were shaking, covered in a fine layer of gray dust, but I gripped my secondary tablet like a lifeline. I need the structural schematics for the sub-basement levels, right now, bellowed the fire chief, a burly man whose helmet was already coated in white debris. I have them, I stepped forward, pushing past a police officer. I'm Sarah Williams. I was the lead structural engineer until 40 minutes ago. I have the live load blueprints right here. The chief didn't ask questions. He pulled me to the hood of his cruiser. Show me the load-bearing walls. Where would they have been standing when the mezzanine pancaked? I traced a line on the glowing screen, my heart heavy. They were headed toward the Central Inspection Corps. If they made it past the threshold, they might be in a void space here, but if they were still under the primary archway. I swallowed hard. It's a complete structural failure. For 3 agonizing hours, I stayed at the perimeter, guiding the rescue teams through the digital labyrinth of the collapsed floors. At 1:30 p.m., a shout went up from the rubble pile. Search and rescue dogs had found something. A stretcher was brought out, carried carefully over the unstable debris. It was Colton. He was covered in blood and dust, clutching his arm, which hung at a gruesome angle. He was alive. The medics rushed him into the back of a waiting ambulance. I felt a surge of cold fury. He survived the trap he built, but 30 minutes later, another stretcher emerged. This one moved slower. A heavy tarp was pulled up over the face. Who is it? I asked a passing paramedic, my voice barely a whisper. Young guy, city inspector badge in his pocket. Reed, I think. The world tilted on its axis. Julian, the bright-eyed kid who wanted to build bridges, was gone because an arrogant man couldn't handle a woman telling him he was wrong. The sirens wailed, a mourning cry for the innocent, and in that moment, the sadness in my chest hardened into absolute, unbreakable steel. By 4:00 p.m., I was sitting in the dark of my home office, the blinds drawn tight against the afternoon sun. The only light came from the dual monitors on my desk. My sister, Bella, sat on the sofa behind me, silently handing me a mug of hot tea. I hadn't taken a sip. I was too busy hunting. Colton thought he had silenced me when he smashed my field tablet on the concrete. What his outdated, arrogant mind didn't grasp was that my diagnostic software synced to a secure cloud server every 60 seconds. I wasn't just pulling up the data from the collapse, I was pulling up 3 months of systematic negligence. How bad is it, Sarah? Bella asked softly, her eyes resting on the chaotic graphs filling my screens. It's worse than I thought, I replied, my fingers flying across the keyboard. Look at this. 3 weeks ago, I flagged the steel supplier. The tensile strength reports on the rebar used in the north wing were forged. The yield strength was 20% below code. I sent Colton 5 separate emails about it. I pulled up the correspondence. Colton, we cannot pour the mezzanine until we replace the grade 40 steel with the mandated grade 60. It will not hold under seismic stress. His reply, sent at 2:14 a.m. the next day, was glaring on the screen. Stop playing hall monitor, Williams. The steel is fine. Pouring tomorrow. Do not delay my crew again, or I'll find an engineer who understands deadlines. He knowingly used substandard materials to pocket the budget difference, I muttered, saving the email into an encrypted folder. And then, when the earth shook, he fired the only person legally required to assess the damage, just to hide his tracks from the city inspectors. I clicked over to the real-time sensor logs from the morning. I had the exact millisecond the shear walls failed. I had the pressure readings. It was an indisputable forensic roadmap of manslaughter. "He's going to blame you," Bella warned. "He's going to say you signed off on the earlier stages." "Let him try," I said, a cold smile touching my lips. I kept a separate, notarized log of every rejected inspection that he overrode. But Bella, going to the police isn't enough. The company, Sterling Heights, will just pay a fine. Colton will declare bankruptcy and walk away with his hidden offshore accounts. I turned to look at her, the glow of the monitors casting long shadows in the room. "I'm not just going to put him in jail. I'm going to take everything he has ever built." At precisely 9:00 a.m. the next morning, I walked into the sleek, glass-walled offices of Mercer and Associates. The air smelled of polished mahogany and expensive espresso. Arthur Mercer was sitting behind his massive desk, reading the morning paper. The headlines screamed in bold black ink: "Tragedy AT Sterling HEIGHTS, Inspector Killed in Collapse." Arthur looked up, adjusting his silver-rimmed glasses. He was a shark in a tailored suit, a man who spoke fluent contract law and corporate destruction. "Sarah," he said, gesturing to the leather chair opposite him, "I saw the news, a terrible tragedy. I assume you are here because Mr. Jones is already preparing his scapegoat narrative." "He's already started," I said, dropping a thick, bound dossier onto his desk. "I got a call from the Sterling Heights corporate office at 7:00 a.m. They are suspending my consulting license pending an investigation, claiming I failed to report the structural anomalies." Arthur opened the dossier, his eyes scanning the first page. "And what is this?" "Everything. The forged steel manifests, the overridden safety protocols, the sensor data from the quake, and the audio recording of him firing me 10 minutes before the collapse because female engineers panic." Arthur's eyebrows crept up his forehead. "Audio recording." My phone was in my breast pocket, recording the whole altercation. "It's crystal clear." Arthur leaned back, a predatory gleam in his eye. "This is gross negligence, Sarah. It's criminal. We can hand this to the district attorney today." "No," I said firmly, leaning forward. "The DA will get his turn, but first we trigger the trap." I pulled a single, sealed envelope from my purse and slid it across the desk. Arthur opened it, pulling out a complex legal charter. "Arthur, Colton and Richard Sterling think the massive insurance policy underwriting this multi-million-dollar disaster is held by a faceless conglomerate in Delaware." Arthur read the document, his eyes widening slightly. "Williams Capital Investments." "Exactly," I said. "A silent firm I started 10 years ago. We underwrote the liability bond for the Sterling Heights project." Arthur looked from the paper to me, realizing the sheer magnitude of what I was saying. "Sarah, Clause 4B of this bond states that in the event of gross negligence or deliberate safety violations by the primary contractor, the insurance payout is nullified, and the contractor is personally liable for all damages, forfeiting personal equity to the underwriter." "Yes," I replied, my voice steady and cold. "Colton Jones bypassed safety, used cheap steel, and fired his certified assessor. He triggered the clause. I don't just want him in handcuffs, Arthur. I want his house, his cars, his bank accounts, and his shares in the company. I want it all." By Wednesday at 8:00 a.m., 72 hours after the concrete fell, Arthur Mercer's conference room looked like a war room. The smell of stale espresso and dry erase markers hung heavily in the air. Sunlight struggled to pierce the gray clouds outside, casting a flat, unforgiving light over the mountains of printed financial ledgers covering the massive oak table. With the fixer removed from our strategy, Arthur and his team of forensic accountants became my primary weapons, but they needed my engineering expertise to know where to look. "You can't just steal $3 million from a construction budget," I explained, standing before a whiteboard covered in flowcharts. I circled a specific vendor code with a red marker. "The banks monitor the escrow disbursements. To steal it, you have to buy something real, just much cheaper than what you billed for." Arthur adjusted his glasses, looking at the spreadsheet glowing on the projector. So, we are looking for the variance between the grade 60 steel you mandated and the grade 40 steel that was actually delivered. Exactly, I said, tapping the board. Colton didn't buy the steel directly. He used a procurement subcontractor. Look at the manifests from August 12th through the 28th. The invoices are from a company called Apex Materials. But when I checked the metallurgical tags on the rebar delivered to the site, they didn't match Apex's standard mill stamps. They were cheap imports. One of Arthur's young accountants, a sharp woman named Chloe, furiously typed on her laptop. I'm running a trace on Apex Materials now. It's an LLC registered in Nevada. Formed, wait for it, exactly 2 weeks before the Sterling Heights project broke ground. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. Julian had died because of a Nevada shell company. Who is the registered agent? It's heavily obscured through a proxy service, Chloe replied, her eyes reflecting the blue light of the screen. But let me cross-reference the routing numbers used to pay Apex with Colton Jones's known banking institutions. For 3 hours, the room fell into a tense, rhythmic silence broken only by the clatter of keyboards and the shuffling of paper. I paced the length of the room, my mind flashing back to the dust cloud, the sirens, and the heavy tarp over the stretcher. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Colton's dismissive voice calling it female panic. At 11:45 a.m., Chloe stopped typing. She let out a sharp breath. Got him. Arthur leaned forward. Show us. Apex Materials builds Sterling Heights for $2 million of high-tensile steel, Chloe explained, throwing a new document onto the projector. They then purchased $1 million of substandard steel from an overseas supplier. The remaining $1 million was funneled through a series of holding accounts and eventually landed in a private wealth management fund in the Cayman Islands. And the signatory on that fund? Arthur asked softly. Colton Jones, I whispered, reading the name off the screen. Arthur smiled, but there was no warmth in it. It was the smile of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. He didn't just cause a collapse, Sarah. He committed wire fraud, embezzlement, and corporate espionage. The negligence was just a byproduct of his greed. Print it all, I said, my voice hardening into a blade. Make 3 copies, bind them in heavy cardstock. Tomorrow is the emergency board meeting at Sterling Heights. They requested my presence to discuss my termination. It's time to show them what I've been discussing. Friday morning at 10:00 a.m., the Sterling Heights corporate headquarters on the 50th floor felt like a fortress in the sky. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, a stark contrast to the dark, oppressive atmosphere inside the boardroom. I sat at the far end of a 30-foot glass table, flanked by Arthur Mercer and a towering stack of black folders. At the head of the table sat Richard Sterling, the CEO. He looked exhausted, his expensive suit hanging loosely on his frame. To his right sat Colton Jones. Colton wore his arm in a thick, pristine white sling, playing the part of the wounded hero perfectly. He looked at me with a mixture of contempt and smug satisfaction. Ms. Williams, Richard began, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. We are here to formally finalize your termination. In light of the tragic events on Tuesday, the board feels that your failure to properly halt construction, combined with your erratic behavior on site, leaves us with immense liability. Erratic behavior? I asked calmly, folding my hands on the table. Colton scoffed, leaning in. You were hysterical, Sarah. Screaming about sensors, trying to cause a panic. If you had just done your job and filed a proper report instead of having a meltdown, Julian Reed might still be alive. You abandoned your post. The sheer audacity of his lie was breathtaking. I didn't yell. I didn't defend myself. I simply reached into my pocket, pulled out my new phone, and set it on the glass table. Arthur, I said quietly. Arthur slid the first black folder across the polished glass to Richard Sterling. Mr. Sterling, before you finalize any paperwork, I suggest you review Exhibit A. Richard frowned, opening the folder. What is this? I am an engineer, Richard, I said, my voice projecting clearly across the room. My job is to measure, record, and assess. I don't rely on emotion. I rely on data. I pressed play on my phone. The audio was crystal clear, captured perfectly by the microphone in my breast pocket just minutes before the collapse. My own voice played first. "Julian, get out of there. The mezzanine joints are failing." Then came the sound of a struggle, followed by Colton's booming, arrogant voice filling the silent boardroom. "That's enough, Sarah. You've been hysterical since the first shake. You're fired. I'm sick of this female engineer panic every time a truck drives by." The recording continued, capturing my desperate pleas and Colton explicitly guiding the inspectors into the building to hide the sensor warnings. "They're professionals, Sarah, not like you. Come on, let me show you the reinforcement on the 5th floor." The audio ended with the terrifying, muffled roar of the building coming down. The boardroom was dead silent. The blood had completely drained from Richard Sterling's face. He looked up slowly, his eyes locking onto Colton, who was now gripping his good hand into a tight, trembling fist. "You told me she walked off the site," Richard whispered, his voice shaking with sudden fury. "You told me she abandoned them." "She provoked me," Colton stammered, the smugness evaporating, replaced by a desperate, cornered panic. "She was faking the data, she." "I faked nothing," I interrupted, my voice cracking like a whip. "And the audio is just the beginning, Colton. We haven't even talked about the steel yet." The air in the boardroom was so thick you could choke on it. Arthur tapped the second black folder. "Mr. Sterling, turn to page 42. You'll find a direct forensic trace of $31 million embezzled from your construction budget, funneled through a proxy company called Apex Materials, and deposited into an offshore account owned by Colton Jones." Colton shot up from his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. "That is a lie. This is defamation. She's fabricating documents to save her own skin." "Sit down, Colton," Richard barked, his eyes scanning the banking traces Chloe had painstakingly verified. He looked physically ill. "Is this true? Did you swap the grade 60 steel?" "It's a complete fabrication," Colton shouted, pointing a trembling finger at me. "She's a bitter, fired consultant trying to ruin me." "The metallurgical reports from the wreckage confirm it," I said, staring directly into Colton's panicked eyes. "The city inspectors pulled the rebar from the collapsed mezzanine yesterday. It yielded at 40,000 psi. It was cheap, imported garbage. You built a coffin, Colton, and you pocketed the difference." Richard rubbed his temples, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the disaster. My God, the liability, the lawsuits from the city, from Reed's family. The company is going to be bankrupt. The insurance will never cover criminal negligence of this magnitude. "That is correct, Richard," Arthur said smoothly, steepling his fingers. "Standard insurance policies contain strict clauses regarding gross negligence and intentional fraud." Colton, sweating profusely now, tried to regain some semblance of control. "Fine, so I go to jail for fraud, but the company is an LLC, Richard. They can't touch our personal assets. We declare bankruptcy, the insurance battles it out in court for a decade, and we walk away. She can't take our homes." I let out a slow, dark laugh that made the hairs on the back of Colton's neck stand up. "You really don't read the contracts you sign, do you, Colton?" I stood up, walking slowly around the massive table until I was standing directly across from him. "You think you're protected by a faceless corporate underwriter. You think the insurance company is just going to eat the $50 million loss while you hide behind a corporate shield." "They have to," Colton sneered, though his voice lacked its usual venom. "That's what insurance is for." "Arthur," I commanded, "explain Clause 4B. Arthur opened the final, thinnest folder. The underwriter for the Sterling Heights project is Williams Capital Investments. Under Clause 4B of the surety bond, if the primary contractor is found guilty of deliberate safety violations resulting in catastrophic failure, the corporate shield is dissolved. The contractor becomes personally liable to the underwriter for the entire cost of the bond. Colton blinked, his brain struggling to process the legal jargon. Williams Capital, what does that mean? I leaned down, placing both my hands on the glass, bringing my face inches from his. It means, I whispered, every word dripping with 10 years of hard-earned power, that I own Williams Capital Investments. I am the underwriter. You didn't just defraud a faceless bank, Colton. You defrauded me. And by triggering that clause, you just legally forfeited your house, your cars, your offshore accounts, and every single penny you will ever earn to me. The silence in the corporate boardroom was absolute. Colton stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled onto a dry dock. The smug, untouchable Foreman who had mocked my female panic just days ago was suddenly struggling to draw a single breath. You! He choked out, his eyes darting frantically between me, Arthur Mercer, and Richard Sterling. You can't do that. That's illegal. That's a massive conflict of interest. It is a perfectly legal dual-entity structure, Arthur stated calmly, placing the final set of heavily bound documents right in front of Colton's trembling good hand. Ms. Williams's engineering consultancy and her investment firm are legally distinct, heavily walled corporate entities. You signed the surety bond agreement in the presence of a notary, Mr. Jones. Clause 4B is ironclad. And because your deliberate negligence resulted in a fatality, the civil forfeiture triggers immediately alongside the criminal referral. At exactly 10:45 a.m., the heavy oak doors to the boardroom swung open. Two men in dark suits stepped in, their faces grim, flashing silver badges. They weren't private building security. They were detectives from the city's major crimes division. Colton Jones, the taller detective asked, his deep voice cutting through the thick, suffocating tension of the room. Colton backed away from the glass table, his good hand knocking over a crystal pitcher of water. It shattered violently on the polished hardwood floor, a sharp, echoing sound terrifyingly reminiscent of the breaking steel 2 days prior. Richard, do something. He pleaded, his voice cracking into a high, desperate whine. Richard Sterling stood slowly, sheer disgust radiating from his tired, lined face. I am stripping you of all authority, Colton. You are fired, effective immediately. And Sterling Heights will be fully cooperating with both the police and Ms. Williams's firm to recover every single stolen asset. The detectives moved with practiced speed. One grabbed Colton's uninjured arm, spinning him around forcefully and clicking a cold metal cuff onto his wrist, securing it tightly to his belt loop since he couldn't connect it to his sling-bound arm. Colton Jones, you are under arrest for gross criminal negligence, corporate wire fraud, and involuntary manslaughter in the death of Julian Reed, the detective recited, his tone flat and entirely procedural. Sarah, please. Colton screamed as they marched him toward the glass doors. His trademark arrogance was entirely stripped away, leaving only a terrified, broken man in its wake. I'll give the money back. I'll tell the city it was all my fault. Just don't let her take my house. My kids need that house. I stood at the table, my expression completely unchanged. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel a rush of triumphant victory. I simply felt the cold, heavy satisfaction of a solid foundation settling securely into bedrock. You didn't care about Julian's family when you sent him into a collapsing building, I said quietly, my voice carrying clearly across the quiet room. You didn't care about safety protocols, and you didn't care about the truth. You only cared about your empire. I watched as they pushed him out into the hallway, his panicked protests fading into the quiet elevator lobby. The financial trap I had laid months ago had sprung with lethal, undeniable precision. He had thought my warnings were just the hysterical ramblings of a woman out of her depth. He never realized he was arguing with the architect of his total destruction. Arthur calmly packed the folders back into his fine leather briefcase, the distinct click of the brass latches sounding like a judge's final gavel. Well, Ms. Williams, I believe our business here is concluded. 7 months later, November 14th, 2:00 p.m. The autumn air was crisp and biting as I stood on the concrete sidewalk outside the federal courthouse. The leaves on the massive maple trees lining the plaza had turned a deep, bruised purple. I pulled my thick wool coat tighter around my shoulders, keeping my eyes fixed on the heavy bronze doors. My sister, Bella, stood right next to me, holding 2 steaming paper cups of coffee. "They're reading the verdict right now," she murmured, handing me a cup. The cardboard was wonderfully warm against my chilled fingers. "The criminal verdict is just a formality at this point," I said, taking a slow, comforting sip. "Arthur already finished dismantling him in civil court last Tuesday." And it was the absolute truth. Over the past 7 months, Colton Jones had experienced a systemic, excruciating financial demolition. When Williams Capital Investments officially activated the surety bond clause, it acted like a ruthless financial black hole. Colton had desperately tried to wire his Cayman Island funds to a shell account in his wife's name, but Arthur's forensic team had already secured global freezing injunctions. First went his sprawling, 6-bedroom luxury estate in the suburbs. It was auctioned off in a matter of weeks to cover the immediate legal fees Sterling Heights incurred fighting the city's zoning board. Then went his prized collection of vintage sports cars. His lucrative investment portfolios, his retirement funds, and every ounce of equity he held in the construction firm were legally seized, rapidly liquidated, and redirected entirely into the victims' compensation fund I had established for Julian's family and the injured workers. He was left with absolutely nothing. His wife, horrified by the public revelations of his fraud and facing total personal ruin, filed for divorce and moved their children to another state to escape the relentless press cycle. Suddenly, the heavy bronze doors of the courthouse swung open. A massive swarm of local reporters pushed forward, their camera shutters clicking frantically like a swarm of angry locusts. Through the chaotic crowd walked Colton Jones. He was dressed in a bright Orange County jumpsuit, his wrists heavily shackled in front of him, flanked by 2 towering bailiffs. He looked at least a decade older. His hair, once slick and dark, was now entirely gray. His shoulders were slumped, his chest hollowed out. He was a man who had been utterly crushed by the weight of his own monumental arrogance. "Colton, any words for the Reed family?" A young reporter shouted, thrusting a foam-tipped microphone toward his face. He didn't answer. He just kept his hollow eyes glued to the pavement, shuffling miserably toward the waiting armored transport van. But just before he reached the steel doors of the vehicle, he stopped and looked up. His bloodshot eyes locked directly onto mine across the crowded plaza. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just stood there, flanked by my supportive sister, holding my coffee. I wanted him to see me clearly, the woman he had dismissed, mocked, and tried to violently silence. I wanted his absolute last memory as a free man to be the face of the female engineer who built the inescapable cage he was about to spend the next 20 years living inside. He broke eye contact first, his head dropping in defeat as the bailiffs pushed him into the dark interior of the van. The heavy metal doors slammed shut with a definitive, ringing finality. "It's over," Bella whispered, leaning her head affectionately against my shoulder. "Yes," I said, watching the van pull away from the curb. He thought gravity was just a suggestion, but you can't build a life on a foundation of lies. Eventually, the earth shakes and everything comes crashing down. 2 years later, at 6:30 p.m., the setting sun painted the evening sky in brilliant strokes of tangerine and deep violet. I sat on the wide, wraparound back porch of my home, a quiet property nestled against the edge of a dense, green forest. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth, a stark, beautiful contrast to the concrete dust that used to fill my lungs. The only sounds were the gentle rustling of the wind through the ancient oak trees and the soft, rhythmic creaking of my rocking chair. My golden retriever, Barnaby, lay happily at my feet. Spread across the rustic wooden table in front of me were the finalized blueprints for the Julian Reed Memorial Library, a beautiful community project funded entirely by Williams Capital. A cool evening breeze fluttered the edges of the heavy parchment. I traced the reinforced steel lines of the schematic with my pen, smiling softly to myself. The structure was perfect. over-engineered, incredibly resilient, and absolutely safe. As I looked out at the peaceful tree line, I took a deep, cleansing breath. The terrible storm that had ripped through my life had finally passed, leaving behind a clear, quiet calm. The massive lawsuits were settled. Colton was serving his second long year in federal prison, and the city had implemented strict, new oversight laws named in Julian's honor. The darkness of that morning had finally given way to light. But as I sit here in this peace, I know there are others out there walking onto their own unstable job sites, dealing with their own toxic environments, facing people who will try to tear them down. So, I want to take a moment to look right at you, wherever you are watching from today. I made critical mistakes early on in my career. I ignored the subtle red flags because I desperately wanted to be a team player. I compromised my own authority because I was exhausted from fighting the constant, grinding sexism in my industry. I thought if I just kept my head down, worked twice as hard, and did my job perfectly, the truth would naturally protect me. The biggest lesson I learned from Colton's catastrophic betrayal is that quiet competence is never enough to protect you from corrupt people. Arrogance mixed with unbridled greed is a dangerous, explosive combination, and hoping a toxic person will suddenly find a moral compass is a fool's game. You have to actively protect yourself before the collapse happens. If you take anything from my story today, let it be these actionable steps. First, document absolutely everything. Keep a meticulous paper trail, take time-stamped photos, and always back up your data to a secure, private location. Trust, but aggressively verify. Second, never let anyone override your professional boundaries or dismiss your hard-earned expertise, especially by weaponizing your gender or your emotions against you. If they call you difficult, bossy, or hysterical for demanding safety or fairness, you are almost certainly standing in the way of their deceit. Finally, build your own unshakable safety net, whether it's a robust financial reserve, a trusted legal contact, or an ironclad exit strategy. You are your own best underwriter. Do not rely on the integrity of those who have explicitly shown you they have none. The world is full of people who will try to cut corners and build their empires on cheap, fragile steel. Your job is to stand firm, trust your own instruments, and make sure your personal foundation is unbreakable. If this story of justice touched you, please like, share, and subscribe. Let's keep building stronger futures together.